Hi everyone, I'll just wait for a few more people to pile in. That's looking great. That's connecting to audio. I'll get started. So we are recording, as you may have seen, just to let you know. My name is Karen Dyberg and I'm one of the founders of Lawyers for Climate Justice. Thanks so much for joining us for our first ever webinar. I'm going to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay deep respect to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Lawyers for Climate Justice acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander laws and practices have protected country for millennia. And we acknowledge that the legal system we're working in causes harm to the environment and is superimposed in a land where systems to protect the environment have been established and long running. Across the continent, we're on the country of various peoples. I'm on Wandjeribarra country in the Yugambeh language group in the Gold Coast hinterland, and say Jingari Jimbalang, hello friends. I'm going to hand over to my fellow lawyer for climate justice, Monica Taylor, to introduce the speakers. Thanks, Bon.
Thanks so much, Karen, and a very warm welcome to all of you on the line tonight. I'll introduce our fantastic speakers momentarily, but before I do, I just wanted to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia. We're a national network of solicitors, barristers, legal academics, and law students exploring ways that the legal system can be harnessed to address the climate crisis. We join a growing chorus of professions across Australia: doctors, veterinarians for climate action, engineers declare, diplomats, psychologists, farmers, parents, bushfire survivors, are all seeking a future that's clean, green, equitable and sustainable. And we know that the legal profession has a unique role in supporting Australia to become a climate leader in transitioning our society to a clean and green future. And given the election result on the weekend, we are feeling super energised, and I'm sure you all are as well. The initial idea for Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia came up in the lead up to the historic school strike for climate in 2019. More than 300 lawyers and students signed an open letter to the Law Council of Australia calling for it to declare a climate emergency. And I know that many of you who've registered to come along tonight were involved in that action. And you may know that the Law Council has now formally released a climate change policy that happened towards the end of last year. So the push for action by lawyers and students made a difference. And what we're hoping to do in the coming months is to formalise our operations so that we have an organisational framework to scale up our work and grow our impact. This event is the first of what we hope to be many, many actions. And the more voices we have, the more of you that can participate in our work, the stronger our movement for climate justice will be. Tonight, we are really pleased to be joined by three terrific speakers. Dr. Chris McGrath is a barrister practicing in environmental and climate change law. Amelia Otten is a proud Bundjalung woman and graduate lawyer with Legal Aid Queensland. And Zoe Bush, a senior solicitor in Environmental Defenders Office's Safe Climate team, who's based in Sydney. So Chris, Amelia and Zoe are all going to share their perspective on what being a climate conscious lawyer means in practice and how we can support one another to pursue climate conscious legal work. They'll pass the baton from one to another and they'll speak in that order. And then hopefully, time permitting, there'll be an opportunity to put some questions to them at the end. So please use the chat, pop in questions as they come to you. That's the best way for me to monitor what you want to ask them. And also, if you can use that chat for comments and thoughts to keep it lively, that'll give us a real sense of being in the room together. And just a reminder, of course, that this event is being recorded. So thank you so much. I'll hand over to Chris to get us started.
Thanks so much, Monica. It's actually wonderful to see everyone here. I'm just looking at the list of names, and I know many people come from either private practice. We've got a range of students, some government lawyers, so welcome everyone. And I do a particular shout out to Kirsty Ruddock. I see you there, Kirsty. So Kirsty is one of the most amazing lawyers I've ever worked with, and she's just rejoined the Environmental Defender's Office. So welcome back, Kirsty. It's great to have you. I've got a few slides to share, so I'll just share my screen. So Monica, on your screen now, do you have a slide with some firefighters?
Yep, looking good, Chris.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak to you tonight about climate conscious lawyering. And I want to also recognize and respect the traditional custodians of this land, elders past, present, and emerging. They can teach us so many important lessons about caring for country. In outline, I'm just going to touch on three things. I'm going to tell you a story, my story of becoming a climate litigator. I hope you can learn, I hope that's helpful for you. And I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking Chief Judge Preston's article on climate conscious lawyering, and then finish with a key point that, at least in my view, any good lawyer is a climate conscious lawyer. So to start with the story, my story of becoming a climate litigator begins growing up in the Whitsunday Islands within the Great Barrier Reef many, many decades ago. I was just saying before the seminar started, I just celebrated my 50th birthday last Friday. Unfortunately, I tested positive to COVID the day before, so I'm just ending my 7 days COVID isolation, but thankfully I haven't died. So as a 50-year-old now, looking back, my path here begins a long time ago. This picture was taken when I was about 14. I'm the boy squinting. My dad's standing beside me. I actually remember this day really vividly because the beach was just so white, it was glowing. And I remember I couldn't look at the camera. My brother took this picture and it was taken at the northern end of Whitehaven Beach in the Whitsunday Islands. So pretty well where this red circle is shown in this slide. So Whitsundays, if you've ever been there, is this amazing group of islands nestled in the Great Barrier Reef. Whitsunday Island is the biggest island in the group, and Hill Inlet runs in to Whitsunday Island, and Whitehaven Beach runs, you can see that massive beach stretching there. So if you often see pictures of, advertisements of Queensland or Australia, often it's taken at Whitehaven Beach. So an amazing place, and yeah, it was an amazing place to grow up. So having grown up there, I went to university, studied science and law, and when I worked for Queensland government for a while, started at the bar in 2000. And I started doing a PhD at about the same time I was looking at laws protecting the Great Barrier Reef. And so I was really looking at the research on a whole range of threats to the reef. When I started my PhD, I didn't think, the reef was so enormous, so it seemed so resilient. I thought climate change wasn't an immediate threat. Maybe it would be in the future, but I thought land source pollution and fishing and those sorts of impacts were the immediate threat to the reef. But then that view changed rapidly in 2004, reading the research that came out of the 1998 and 2002 coral bleaching events, when the reef was first, now we've had a whole series of mass coral bleaching events. But in 2004, some of the early research came out, and I thought it was obvious right then that climate change was an existential threat to the reef. I was working as a barrister at the time, and it was a period of climate denial under the Howard government. So Howard was a lot like Morrison. Thank Christ the election turned out and we've gotten rid of that horrible government. But it was Morrison pretty well copied Howard of delay, delay, delay. And yeah, so in this period of terrible inaction by the federal government, it was, in my view, just obvious that climate change was an existential threat. And I became haunted by the question, will we leave the Great Barrier Reef for our children? And I'm a believer in we should use the tools we've got to fight to save what we can. So if I could go back in time, and I was better at maths, I'd probably go back and do chemical engineering or electrical engineering and work on batteries and renewable power. But too late for that for me. So I'm a lawyer, and I think, well, what can I do to save what I can. As a lawyer, litigation is a major tool we have to protect both our clients and the public interest. So since 2005, I've acted in a series of climate cases against large coal mines in Queensland and New South Wales. I've just listed them here. I do case studies on my website, envlaw.com.au, if you're interested in any of those. Some of the big cases against Adani were some of the hardest fought. There's large case studies there. I also work on identifying climate litigation opportunities really for the last 10 years of my career. As I said, I've turned 50. I sort of think hopefully I'll be healthy for another 10 years. So another 10 years of my career, and I look around and think, well, what can I do to do the best I can in the last 10 years? So there's only a few big cases I've probably got left in my career. And a key point that I would make is that as a climate litigator, my view is liability for climate damages will drive a wave of future litigation. So in the sort of first generation of litigation we've had in the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've seen cases against big coal mines and approvals of, fossil fuel projects. But what's coming, and we've also seen some important corporate litigation, shareholder litigation, those sorts of things. So those are important issues, and we're seeing human rights cases come on more and more. But to me, the big tsunami of litigation that's coming is around damages. So big class actions by insurers for, say, flood damages, for bushfire damages. Those are the big cases that will come in the future. I've written about that in an article a few years ago in the Environmental Planning Law Journal. There's a link in my slides if you want to look at it, and on my website. A key point that I make in that article is that liability for climate change is widespread, but largely unrealized. And that proposition flows logically from 4 facts. First, that billions of people and trillions of dollars of property are being and will be impacted by climate change. Second, that common law causes of action and modern environmental laws are wide on their face and apply to activities that cause climate change in the same way they do to other forms of pollution. The third fact is that a core function of courts is to provide remedies for people who suffer damage due to the actions of others. So we saw Justice Brumberg in the Sharma case, the trial judge in that case, really showing that. He saw this case, he gave a remedy. Yes, it got overturned by the full court recently, but that sort of trial judge decision is just the exercise of a core function of the court. You're providing remedies for people that suffer damage due to the actions of others. Now, the fourth point, though, is despite on its face widespread liability, there's relatively few cases brought globally. Some are in the order of 1,000, 2,000, which means that liability is largely unrealized. My view is we're going to see a tsunami of litigation in coming years. So if you're early in your career now, you're going to see in coming years just more and more cases, big class actions against fossil fuel, major fossil fuel emitters, miners, and AGLs, those sorts of things, those sorts of defendants. I just mentioned as an aside that I think one of the underlying issues for your career is going to be grappling with the trauma of the huge loss and damage that we, our clients, and our world is suffering. Anyone that lived through the Australian bushfires a few years ago or the recent floods, the incredible trauma that creates is something that we have to deal with as professionals as part of it. And that amazing case that's just been decided by the High Court about the trauma, the liability for psychiatric trauma caused to a DPP solicitor for her work in the serious sexual offences section of the DPP. That amazing case, I read that and I thought of the many issues for climate litigators and the trauma that we suffer. So that's my story. I just want to unpack Chief Justice Preston's climate conscious lawyering article a little bit. You may have seen it in the Australian Law Journal. It's also freely available. If you don't have access to the ALJ, it's also freely available on the Land Environment Court's website as an earlier paper that he presented that was then published in the ALJ. But Chief Judge Preston wrote that a climate conscious approach requires an active awareness of the reality of climate change and how it interacts with daily legal problems. And that's really the core of the idea. He wrote about 5 different aspects of climate conscious lawyering, but I want to focus on the first one, holistic legal advice. He wrote, a commonly held view is that lawyers should give advice only about the law. The law is a lawyer's area of expertise and they should confine themselves to that expertise. The problem with this view is that legal problems and disputes are never only about the law. Providing clients with sound legal advice to solve a legal problem or disputes requires addressing not merely legal issues, but also the financial, emotional, and psychological, the relational and social and environmental and other ethical consequences of different courses of action. Clients can thereby understand the consequences, costs, and uncertainties associated with alternative courses of action and make an informed choice. I fully agree with what Chief Judge Preston says there, but what he calls a holistic lawyer, that might seem a little bit strange to you. And I don't particularly like the term. What he refers to as a holistic lawyer, I just see as a good lawyer. I've never subscribed to the view that a lawyer or should be a narrow technical advisor. A good lawyer is not just a narrow technical advisor. They also give their clients wise counsel by identifying risks and opportunities that the clients themselves may not see. So climate change is both a risk and an opportunity any good lawyer will consider in their day-to-day practice. So if the ethical arguments don't convince you or your colleagues, let's just say you're a junior lawyer in a major law firm and you want to raise climate issues and a senior partner says, oh, look, that's just all political. Well, your answer to them, obviously, you know, situational, you mightn't feel the power to, you know, raise it, but my response to them is the legal case should be compelling for them, because any good lawyer in normal practice will advise their clients or employers, if you're an in-house lawyer. So if you're working for government or you're in-house in some large company, well, you're going to be advising your client or your employer about where climate change creates risks for the client and also opportunities for many clients. So let's just say you're giving advice to an insurer and they've suffered billions of dollars of loss for bushfires or major floods driven by climate change. Well, who can you sue? You're going to be looking at options for that and potential class actions. In terms of risks, there's a really important story playing out in the news at the moment with Mike Canning's Brooks looking to stop the demerger for AGL Energy. And he wrote last week about how if AGL breaks away and puts its coal-fired power generators in a separate sort of group, that it risks being insolvent. And so those sorts of issues should throw up massive red flags for any corporate lawyer or insolvency lawyer. I just want to note, wrap up in a moment, but I just wanted to note a point about the professional ethics of climate conscious lawyers. I mention it because sometimes when I've been in court, you get the sort of feeling from lawyers representing fossil fuels or government that, you know, why are you here? What are you doing? This is all just political and it's, you know, almost unethical. And I'm strongly against that view, because it's our job as lawyers to find remedies for damage suffered by our clients. And it's unexceptional, perfectly ethical, and not some political statement to do that in the context of seeking remedies for damage caused by climate change. So, you know, looking at climate change issues is not some unethical or political issue. It's a core job for you as a lawyer. So to wrap up, I've looked at a story of becoming a climate litigator. That mightn't be the path that you're interested in. You may well just be, you know, wanting to be a good lawyer. I hope, though, my story gives you some background. I've unpacked Chief Judge Preston's article a little bit, and I wanted to really make the key point that any good lawyer is a climate conscious lawyer. Just to hand over to our next speaker, Amelia Otten is a proud Bundjalung lawyer working at the Legal Aid Queensland. I'm really excited to hear Amelia speak. When we were talking about speakers, so I'm the old crusty version. Amelia and Zoe are the young, zippy, you know, next generation lawyers who are going to take this forward. So we wanted to have different perspectives, both an old crusty like me and the young, bright, super keen young whippersnappers. So Amelia, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. You actually gave me a bit to think about there in terms of why I have to describe myself as a holistic lawyer or having a holistic approach. So I think I'll probably come back to that. But I wanted to start by saying Jingi Walla, which is hello to everybody. I would like to start my bit by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which we all meet today. I join from Gubbi Gubbi country. I recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and South Sea Islander land. And I pledge to always move through this country with respect for the deeply ingrained connections that we as First Nations people share with the land, sea and air. I'm a proud Bundjalung woman. I'm a small business owner and an artist and a recently admitted lawyer in the graduate program at Legal Aid. I was invited here today by a colleague of mine who I met at the Caxton Legal Centre. So it's really nice to see this all come full circle. I follow my matriarchal lines to Bundjalung country, but I did grow up here on Gubbi Gubbi country, the Sunshine Coast. So I have really strong connections to the salt water. My pathway into the legal profession wasn't the smoothest, and it's probably not the story that a lot of lawyers ending up in my position share. I moved out of home at 16 after starting work at about 13, probably not the most legal thing to do, but I put myself through school after moving out of home to finish grade 12. I worked 2 jobs while finishing grade 12 with the determination to get into university. And throughout high school, I balanced my interests in arts, performance and visual, and the law and justice. And I didn't really know where I wanted to go with that. And I didn't really think that I could do both. My teachers told me that I was really good at arguing with them and that maybe I should be a lawyer. So I rolled with that and I ended up at the University of the Sunshine Coast, where I started the first half of my Bachelor of Laws. And then I eventually transitioned to QUT to finish my degree. While I was studying, I worked in a private practice family law firm on the Sunshine Coast for about 2.5 years. And I was actually made redundant there because of COVID. And so that for me was just, I didn't know how to deal with it. Like I said, I've been working since I was about 13. It was the first time that I'd been unemployed. I'm completely self-reliant. I didn't know what to do. And there was sort of a gaping hole in my chest that I didn't know how to deal with it. And I decided that I needed to go back to my roots, think about how to connect with my country and connect with my ancestors in the process to heal myself, to keep moving forward. And my way of doing that was through learning traditional weaving. And the weaving turned into a business that I still have almost 2 years later. So it worked out for the best. I came out of unemployment into a role in doing paralegal and admin work at the Caxton Legal Centre. And this was my first taste of CLC work and not having to send ridiculous bills to clients and asking people for money all the time. And it was there that I discovered that I really love working with people. And I really liked the opportunity to put my knowledge and my experience through law school and my life experiences to practical use in helping people. This is also where I met my beautiful mentor, Rosie, who showed me that I didn't have to separate arts and law and that I could pursue both. Watching her, I saw someone who was a strong woman who cares on an innately deeper level about people and about helping people, but also had a strong passion for the arts and has been recognized for her contributions to both arts and law. And it showed me that the private practice mold that I'd been shown as a university student wasn't the only thing that I could fill, that I could fill other molds, and I decided to do both. So here I am doing both. While I was working in private practice and through Caxton Legal Centre, I completed 2 internships, one with Allens and one with Ashurst, and I went on to Clark at Ashurst, and I worked across the resources, environmental and litigation teams. So I may have been interning across from Chris at some point on some of those things. But that really rounded off my experience in terms of working in private practice, community, and also looking at top tier commercial firms. And it confirmed what I already suspected, is that I don't want to work there. The paycheck at the end of the day wasn't enough to fill my cup, that I needed to get that other sense of satisfaction. And that satisfaction came from knowing that at the end of my life, whenever that may be, I've left some sort of small positive impact on this earth. And so after Caxton, I finished my PLT and somehow got this really great graduate job at Legal Aid, which I'm absolutely loving. And so for me, the path moving forward is unclear, but what I do know is that my path will see me working within my community, with vulnerable people, advocating for them, working with minorities, and importantly for me, working with other First Nations people. The fact that First Nations people are well and truly overrepresented within the justice system isn't just a statistic for me, it's a lived experience. And so I hope to use my voice as a First Nations person to take the opportunity to use it where my family before me didn't have it. I have a grandma who's only in her early 60s, and she grew up ashamed to be Aboriginal, ashamed to be Black. She said she was from Papua New Guinea instead of being Aboriginal because that was better. And she wasn't recognised as a human in Australia until she was about 7 or 8 years old. And for me, that's just unacceptable. And I don't accept that any future generations after me have to carry that level of shame. And so as someone who has had other First Nations people invest time into mentoring me, coaching me, developing me, I want to use their time to continue to help other people and ultimately make the world a better place. So I really just want to make sure that I'm protecting our culture, our young mob coming through. I want to make sure that I can alleviate some of the pressures that they won't have to carry as heavy of a burden as I've had to carry or those before me have had to carry. And I want to protect and respect those sacrifices. And that means protecting our country in the end. For some people, the fact that our environment is dying doesn't even cross their mind. But for me, it's something that I think about every single day, because we have mob losing their country, losing their connections and their culture to the runoff effects of colonization. Our environment is dying and our sacred places are being blown up and the Torres Strait Island is flooding. It's drowning, and that's what's happening to our culture here. And our culture is deeply connected to this country. And so that obviously flows on into an interest in environmental law and protecting the country. For me, being a climate conscious lawyer doesn't just mean driving a Tesla or going digital at your firm. It actually means taking the time to consider the multitude of environmental factors that apply when giving legal advice. So whether it's widely recognized or not, most legal advice encompasses some form of human rights or has some effect over the environment. This environment is my country, and as a First Nations person, it's my responsibility to care for the country and educate allies on how they can do the same. At this junior stage in my career, I am still learning, and I will be learning all the way up until the very end. And I think it's really important, not just for junior lawyers to acknowledge this, but for senior lawyers too, is that we are always learning. This is an evolving world and an evolving pathway, and there's no shame in that. But I want to use that learning and that knowledge to affect change, but within my capacity at any given time. I recognize there are limitations to being a junior lawyer. And so I want to do what I can within those boundaries. For me, this means identifying unspoken problems that a client might not even recognize that they have, and using my education, resources, and experience to empower people with the knowledge. And if I can't identify or if I can't solve their problem, helping them find someone that can. And so that's where I come back to Chris's talk and looking at being a holistic lawyer. And I specifically recall saying this in my interview to Legal Aid, is that I want to look at this with a holistic approach, that I want to, cover all of those problems. Just because someone's come to me for a criminal law problem, it doesn't mean that I can't identify numerous others and help them solve those other problems they didn't even know they had, because one way or another, they are going to arise at some point in time. And so now I think going forward, I'm just going to call myself a good lawyer, not a holistic lawyer. So I'll be wearing that badge proudly, and I encourage other junior lawyers who are unsure to do the same and to look at being well-rounded in their approach to everything where they can. This approach, to me, in my particular line of work, looks like open-ended questions where you give people an opportunity to self-identify, to express. We're not asking closed questions. An example would be triaging a client and asking, what gender do you identify as? And giving them the opportunity to self-identify and to self-express so that you can then respectfully address them correctly, rather than closing the box off to just assuming because they sound female presenting that they must be a female. It also means having to address cultural differences. We are a mixed country and we are lucky to have so many beautiful cultures here, but it also means that there are differences and barriers. And it means taking the time to identify those and learn how to work effectively within those barriers and educating your clients about them. And it obviously means having deeper, longer conversations. But in an industry that's notoriously underfunded, it means that it's equally important that those of you working within the private sector are also taking the time to delve equally as deep and be equally as thorough. This isn't just a responsibility that people working within the climate sector or the community sector can bear alone. It's something that everybody across the entire legal sector can contribute to. And as a First Nations person, I am all too well aware that change cannot be affected just from the bottom. We need people across the entire legal industry making small, conscious choices in their active daily practice that consider the environment and the aspects that flow into affecting our environment from the work that they're doing. Something else that lawyers can be doing, whether you're junior, senior, a student, not even a lawyer, but is donating your time and expertise. For senior practitioners, to me, it means setting an example, taking the time to mentor and advocate for junior lawyers, taking the time to help develop us as young practitioners, and potentially getting involved in things outside of work like this. It also means joining your First Nations committees and relevant environmental committees through your workplaces or out of your workplace, and actively committing to things like reconciliation. And it, in the process of spreading the representation of environmentally conscious voices across the industry. To me, lawyers have a career path that's filled with great opportunities to actively change legislation, set precedents, and affect real environmental change. But in order to do this, we need senior lawyers to set the example, but we also need them to leave a space at the table for more junior voices. The more junior in the profession speak up, it's not out of disrespect, it's not out of overconfidence or not knowing our place. It's because I and we belong to a generation that has an active social conscious, and we're actively dealing with the environmental consequences of the people who came before us. So to the young people, the young practitioners, any age people, you are never just something. You are never just doing a little bit. You are never just a lawyer. You're never just going to a protest. You are doing those things. You are that person and you are making a difference. And so in making that difference, we speak up because we want to affect change, but it means that when the time comes for us to speak up, we need the people who are more senior in the profession to let our voices be heard and to give us a seat at the table. And so that's everything that I'd really thought about. It was a little bit about my background, how I got here and how I sort of stumbled into this place. I really love working in the community sector. I love working with people. And I love the fact that I have the ability to juggle being a lawyer and an artist and a First Nations person and a woman, and being able to wear all of those different hats and be involved in things like this to help educate people, educate allies, and spread information and resources so that collectively we can all be doing that one little bit together every day. I will pass off to Zoe Bush, who is a senior climate lawyer at the Environmental Defenders Office.
Great, thanks so much, Amelia. A couple of hard acts to follow, so I hope not to disappoint. So I'm speaking today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and like any law-related talk, I like to begin by acknowledging the role that law has played and continues to play in colonisation in this country, whether it's dispossessing First Nations peoples of their lands, or stealing First Nations children from their families with impunity, or the mass incarceration of First Nations peoples. The list goes on. You know, the law has played a critical role in colonisation in this country, and I take responsibility for my role as a white lawyer in remedying those injustices in our legal system. So some of you might be familiar with the piece that I wrote with the incredible Fleur Ramsey in the Saturday paper a few weeks ago on lawyers' culpability for the climate crisis. And I've been asked tonight to speak to that, or really flesh out that analysis, but through a more personal story about my journey through the law and how I've come to do the work that I do at the EDO as a climate change litigator. So I guess the story most appropriately begins with a fairly wide-eyed and bushy-tailed 17-year-old Zoe, who due to sort of personal circumstances when I was younger, was acutely aware of and pretty fed up with how power and structural disadvantage operate here in Australia. And so when it came time for that naive little 17-year-old to pick what she wanted to study at uni, she naively thought, well, if I want to achieve change, and law seems like the natural avenue to sort of do that. And obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, I can appreciate that a conservative profession that's quite literally obsessed with precedent wasn't really the right avenue to pick. But as with Chris, I've sort of made my bed now, so it's a little too late to change tack. So I dived into a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Law, and during uni, I really found myself living a double life. On the one hand, I was Zoe, the arts student who, threw myself into campaigns on women's issues on campus, particularly around sexual assault and harassment. I supported the Noongar Tent Embassy in Boolaroo, Perth, and helped refugee families settle into the community here. And on the other hand, I was Zoe, the law student, who was being taught that all I needed to know about the law was the black letter of it, and that the law and lawyers at their best are apolitical, impartial, and neutral. And the disconnect was so great. The disconnect between my two lives was so great that I very nearly dropped out of my law degree halfway through. I was sort of within a whisker, and that because I guess on the one hand I was witnessing all the time the ways that law was a tool of oppression and was being used as an oppressive force, whether it was refugees navigating an ever-hardening Migration Act, or First Nations people suffering so much under the legal fiction of terra nullius, all the while being told that the law was neutral, and to think about the law in its political context and its political consequences was wrong. And that was the wrong way to be a lawyer. A good lawyer was neutral and apolitical. And well, I guess the next part of the story is probably not a plot twist, given I'm speaking to you here tonight, but I was talked off that ledge by one of my professors, and so continued my law degree. But that meant I was a young queer woman navigating who hadn't gone to one of the elite private schools, navigating a really hierarchical, sandstone law school culture, and where old white men constantly told me what was right and what was wrong, and as I said, it felt like my views were falling on the wrong side of that ledger, and so I guess my takeaway lesson was that I was wrong and that my views were wrong, and so I strive to assimilate into that culture and to work on the issues I really cared about in a way that was consistent with it and didn't challenge that narrative of neutrality. And I guess the sad thing is that I was richly rewarded for that, enrolled the scholarships and the media interviews and the job opportunities, and I became completely sucked up in this really toxic bubble of prestige in the law, and like a sort of a good girl who does what she's told to do, I followed that career pathway. I did the judicial associateship. I worked on the High Court cases at the Crown Solicitor's Office. I did the Ivy League Masters, and all the while sort of, ignoring the gut feeling that there was this huge disconnect between my values and what brought me to the law and the work that I was doing. And, you know, there was work that I was doing at the Federal Court and the Crown Solicitor's Office that I was deeply uncomfortable with. You know, I'd sort of gone from helping refugee families settle into community life here in Australia to every full court period being personally involved in sending 4 to 5 people back to near certain death in Afghanistan or Sri Lanka. And yeah, so there was a huge disconnect and I was really struggling with it. But it was also a really formative period of time for my theory of change and the role that law has to play in it. And, you know, whether it was the incredibly decent judge that I had the fortune of being an associate to, or a few excellent ethical lawyers at the Crown Solicitor's Office, I really, you know, I really witnessed firsthand just how important it was for people with a broader ethical understanding of the law and the political context in which it operates to be in those roles and to have that power and to exercise that discretion. And, you know, I think a context where I really noticed it was in the huge amount of native title work that the WA Crown Solicitor's Office does. And I saw lawyers in that context. I repeatedly saw them act as the only bulwark against a state that sometimes sought to abuse its power and resources to undermine native title rights. And you know, and that's in the context of what the state was proposing often wasn't unlawful. It just sort of, it just didn't really pass the pub test. You know, it wasn't really consistent with broader ideas of justice and fairness. And if it hadn't been for those lawyers with that broader sense of ethics and an understanding of the colonial and political context in which those decisions were being made, that power would have gone unchecked to the great detriment of First Nations communities in WA. And you know, I think a really great, and I was exposed to another really great example of it when I was in the US doing my master's, when it's the progressive prosecution movement in the US. So I think traditionally, or sort of not naturally, people who want to see reform in the criminal legal system in the sense of decarceration are attracted to criminal defence work, so the ALS, the legal aid, and do amazing things in those roles. This movement really tries to flip that thinking on its head and says, actually, it's really important that people who are so minded are in prosecutorial roles due to the huge amount of discretion that prosecutors get to exercise, you know, as to whether a charge is, whether a criminal charge is pressed, the sentence that's sought, and so on and so forth, and that most of that discretion isn't reviewable. Most of the exercise of that discretion isn't reviewable, and so people who are, you know, really bring this ethic to these roles can have a huge impact. And I think a really excellent example, and I'll tie this back into the climate stuff soon. A really excellent example is that of Kim Foxx, who was elected the district attorney in Cook County, Illinois. So my understanding is that Cook County is one of, if not the poorest county in Chicago. And Kim Foxx is a Black woman who grew up in the projects there and was raised by a single mum with substance abuse issues. And despite being made homeless at 16 due to family violence issues, she went on to, you know, study law and work in criminal law, and then was ultimately, through this progressive prosecutor movement, elected the district attorney for Cook County. The first thing that Kim did when she took office was invite prisoners in Cook County to notify her office if they thought they had been wrongfully convicted, explain why they thought that was the case, and review those files. And within a year, Fox had released 97 Black people who were wrongfully convicted and were sitting in jail wrongfully. And I just think, you know, if there's any example that, you know, exemplifies just how important it is for people with that broader sense of, that broader understanding of the political context in which the law operates, to be in these roles, I can't think of a better one. I haven't come across a better one yet. And I think that's really illustrative. That theory of change and that example is really instructive for us lawyers who care about climate change. You know, unfortunately, we can't all work for the EDO or the EJA, but maybe that's not where would be the most impactful anyway. Don't worry, Kirsty, I'm not about to leave. We're not the most impactful anyway. You know, whether we're whether we're commercial lawyers, government lawyers, in-house counsel, barristers, there is a way for us to bring this broader ethics, or what Chief Justice Preston would call climate consciousness, into every aspect of our lawyering. And actually, one of my favourite lines from his article is that climate change and the consequences of it should pervade every aspect of legal practice. And given the enormous financial, health, legal, reputational, the list goes on, risks and opportunities that climate change poses, there really is no area of legal practice that's untouched. So in order for us to bring this climate consciousness into our practice, I think we first need to expose the ethical decisions that are being made. So in order for us to decide to act in a particular ethical way, we first have to examine how we're acting at the moment. And I won't speak for Fleur, but that was, part of what really motivated me to write the Saturday paper article. Because under the guise of neutrality, lawyers are profiting handsomely from work that, according to the UN, has us firmly on track to an unlivable world. So in the IPCC's latest report, which was just released a couple of months ago, they clearly told us what is required in order to avoid climate catastrophe. And one of those things is that there can't be any new fossil fuel projects, not a single one. And so that means that every single one of the 114 new fossil fuel projects that are in the pipeline here in Australia, and the legal work that's being done to facilitate them, are a bet against a livable world. And banks and insurance companies are already experiencing, are already being criticised for similar ethical decisions that they're making. And Fleur and I draw on the example of in our article, we draw on the example of the backlash that was received by Commonwealth Bank and Westpac for their financing of the Adani Carmichael coal mine. And ultimately that backlash was so great that both banks, as well as 30 other domestic and international banks, ultimately committed to not financing the mine. And now all big four Australian banks have committed to exiting thermal coal altogether by 2030. So there's been this reckoning in other parts of the profession about these ethical decisions and profiting from new fossil fuel projects, but there's been no similar reckoning, or at least that I've seen in the legal profession. In fact, if you go onto most commercial law firms' websites, they'll boast about having facilitated new fossil fuel projects, indeed that very fossil fuel project, and minimising fossil fuel companies' tax bills. And why? Why is it any different? I think as lawyers like this, and I think that's where we see this neutrality narrative being peddled out to try and to hide behind and to try and justify these ethical decisions. But it's not as if that neutrality narrative hasn't been exposed before. We just need to think about the heat that commercial law firms copped for representing big tobacco and representing employers who tried to deny compensation to asbestos victims as they were dying. That backlash was so great that it really impeded their ability to attract the best and brightest. Increasingly law students, my older colleagues tell me that, when they're in law school, people wouldn't go to these firms who are publicly known to represent these companies because of that representation. And ultimately those firms had to stop representing those companies. And, what's different about fossil fuels? I think, in fact, if anything, it's much, much worse. Like at this stage of the climate crisis, profiting from new fossil fuel projects is not only an ethical decision, it's a decision by a profession that prides itself on being the domain of reason and rationality to act contrary to what is unequivocal science. And how is it consistent with our ethical duty as lawyers to act contrary to unequivocal science, particularly when the consequence is that we're facilitating and profiting from, irreversible harm on a planetary scale. And so I guess, in addition to the sort of maybe more constructive suggestions that have come from Chief Justice Preston and Chris and Amelia, I suggest that climate conscious lawyering also requires us to closely analyse what we need to stop doing. And and profiting from new fossil fuel projects is very high on that list. And
That leads to a question, if you don't mind me butting in, Zoe.
would love you to.
You talked about having climate conscious lawyers potentially in positions of power with the analogy from the US. Should young lawyers try to be in those positions where they might be advising people like fossil fuel companies, or, you know, do they divest to look good? Do they wind down the fossil fuel projects as quickly as possible, or do they just boycott any new fossil fuel projects?
I think that's a really excellent question, Karen. It's actually a conversation. It's a conversation I've been having with, various colleagues in the profession after the Saturday paper article around, what is the most effective strategy here? And it sort of reminds me of the discussions that are being had in the shareholder activism space around, is divestment the most effective strategy, or is engagement and, is engagement the most effective strategy? And ultimately, I think there's no one strategy that's good. I think it's a combination of all of the above, and we need both. And I think there's certainly a huge role for people to play. I think there's a huge role for people, hopefully you'd hope that commercial law firms are starting to have these conversations around, law firm partners are starting to have these conversations around, do we want to be positioning ourselves? And as part of Claire and I's article, we talk about the business case for firms making themselves fossil fuel free and that sort of stuff. But we certainly also need, there's a huge role for lawyers to play, and this really speaks to what Chris was talking about in in advising. Like, a lot of companies are trying to do the right thing, and there is a huge role to be played by lawyers in helping them identify the magnitude of these risks and the best way that they can, and the magnitude of the opportunities, and navigate them in the sort of best way that they can. And so, look, I'm still thinking about that, but at the moment, my answer is it has to be and, not or.
Yeah, 100%.
I was just going to jump in there and thank you so much, Zoe. That was just a really terrific, review of how you've come to be where you are, and also to Amelia as well. I love the honesty of the discussion. Is really tremendous. There's a question that's posted in the chat for anyone to answer, that is asking about the best practical steps or approaches that graduates or junior lawyers that are working in commercial firms can take to assist the climate movement. So continuing on that discussion, Chris?
I think that's a really good question, Matt. I think the very fact that you're asking the question, it already speaks volumes for you, but also in terms of answering it. Asking the question to start with is a massive step, and not just being a clone of the law graduates that just there for for the money, and like large law firms where so the fact you're asking the question, I think the next step I would suggest is to have a think about, if you haven't read Preston's article, have a read about it and dwell on what it means and the implications for it. And I package that as being a good lawyer, and I've got no doubt you want to be a good lawyer. If that's your goal, then there are so many ways that you can bring climate into advising your client or your employer on risks and opportunities around climate. It is just an enormous, so make your goal being a good lawyer, and I think that climate conscious issues will flow naturally from that.
Can I jump in as well? I totally agree. Oh, sorry, Amelia, did you want to go first?
You go.
Okay, all right, and then I'll flip to you. I totally agree, and I'm just gonna be the devil's advocate and say that I also think it's I think at this stage, I think given we're at a really nascent point in the legal profession where all the prestigious legal career pathways tend to be things that do not advance climate justice. So at the moment, it's people who are destroying our climate who get the benefit of being represented by the best and brightest. You know, it's they get the benefit of the best and brightest lawyers and law graduates and stuff. And I think given that we're at such a nascent stage in the profession, I think one of the best things you can do as a graduate is prioritize. And I know there's finite roles. I know there's so many people who like want to come and do this work. And I know there's finite opportunities to do it. And we have to pay the bills and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, if you can, you know, to deprive people who are wrecking our climate of your talent and of your skills, and you know, the people who need it the most are the communities that are on the front line of the climate crisis, and I think that should be the number one priority, acknowledging that's not possible for a variety of personal circumstances. And I think it's also really important to, within whatever role you're in, to incorporate things that Chief Justice Preston talks about, and so does Chris.
And I think for me, following on from what both Zoe and Chris have said, and being someone who was in that position really recently, going into these internships and clerkships, did I know that I wanted to work for them? I kind of knew I didn't want to, because it didn't sit right on my chest, the work that they were doing. But unfortunately, I knew that having those names on my resume was going to get me further. I knew that I might have to sacrifice my soul for a clerkship to get the name on my resume. And until we can change, you know, the status that those firms have in terms of young lawyers being advanced to the profession, sometimes you might have to see it as an opportunity to take advantage of them, take advantage of the name that they can give you, the position they can get you in, whether that means seeing out your graduate program or opting not to do it. But for me, I used those places as stepping stones to give myself what I needed on my resume to land in this point. But I also think a really important thing that you could be doing on a daily basis is actively being openly and honestly yourself. It might make people uncomfortable, but that's not your responsibility, because, you know, if they feel uncomfortable by somebody who's passionate about climate justice, that's a reflection of them and not of you. And I think if you feel comfortable to do so, and if you feel like it's a safe space to do so, you can be, you know, vocal and not necessarily just hiding those things from the workplace.
And there's some great comments and suggestions appearing in the chat from people volunteering at CLCs, being on boards, bring your whole self to work, absolutely. There is a question about additional recommendations for Crown lawyers, so lawyers working in government. Who wants to address that very quickly? I'll throw to you, Zoe.
I think that was my former colleague. Is that Emily O'Keefe? If so, hello, Emily. So good to see you, and thanks for joining. That's so hard. And I think the best I can say is what I was talking about in the native title context, right? Like, and Emily, you'll know some of the lawyers that I was thinking of when I was giving those examples, some of those senior lawyers in the native title team in the Crown, in the State Solicitor's Office, it's called in WA, who just brought this excellent sense of ethics to it, and who, if it weren't for them, you know, the power of the state wouldn't have been exercised in a way that was cognizant of that colonial context in which the law was operating. And I think, you know, as Crown lawyers, I think particularly in WA, there's there's just a basic lack of awareness, from what I can tell, within the government. And so, you know, I think even just, you know, one of the things I found really helpful is making sure that I'm up to date on the climate science, the latest climate science, which is, you know, things like the IPCC saying literally no more fossil fuel projects. Like, if we're going to avoid catastrophe, and so I found it really helpful to stay up to climate science. And for that, I'd recommend following people like Ketan Joshi and Tim Baxter from the Climate Council, and signing up to the Climate Council's updates and staying on top of the climate science, so that when, you know, the state does come to lawyers seeking advice, you know, we can be fully informed of the risks and the science, and you know, and provide our advice within that context. And in saying that, I'd reiterate what Chris said about reading Chief Justice Preston's article, because he sort of talks about, I think he gives some really good examples of all the various ways in which you can incorporate that science and that understanding of the risk into different types of legal advice. I hope that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you so much, Zoe. We are almost at time, so we're going to have to wrap things up. Thank you so much to everyone in the crowd who's used the chat, and we've had such a lovely discussion there. And thank you so much, Amelia, Zoe, and Chris, for giving us your time and sharing your stories and your expertise. We will send out afterwards some of the extra links that were posted in the chat for you all, so you can go and follow up and do some homework if you will. We've got two things to ask of you. The first thing is we'd love for you to please sign the World Lawyers Pledge on Climate Action, and we'll post a copy of the website link there. It's coming up now. And then the other thing is Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia really wants to get your input into the shape of activities that we'll be doing for this year and as we scale up. So please, if you can respond to a survey that we'll be sending out as well, that will really, that'll be terrific. So thank you so much. We're at time. Go and have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks, Monica.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Monica.